Hi, this is Ed Rising, and welcome to episode number 12 of Ed's Pop-O-Matic podcast, a retro pop culture podcast where everything retro beats a new if you keep it in your heart. Today we have a special guest. We have veteran DJ and Beatles historian Ken Michaels. Ken, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Ed.
How
I'm re-
you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm having a good time from this holiday weekend, relaxing a bit.
Super.
And hopefully getting to do some reading that I need to, staying up to date on a lot of the Beatle books that are out there. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm having fun.
my audience should know Ken Michaels from his radio shows and his radio show Everybody Little Thing and podcasts. Um, uh, I can't think of the name right now.
Things we
what is it?
said today
Things We Said Today
and
and
talk more
Talk
talk.
More Talk,
Yep.
and of course Ken Michaels Radio, his website, and YouTube.
Mhm.
He's got his interviews there. But the reason I bring up the interviews is that, as Ken just mentioned, all these writers that he interviews for all these Beatles books, you do have a lot of reading to catch up on.
Well, right now I have an advanced PDF for the McCartney Legacy book. That's the Alan Kozin book
Okay.
that is coming out December 13th with Adrian Sinclair. And I'm just reading every page one at a time, making notes because at some point very soon we'll be interviewing Alan and hopefully Adrian
Yeah,
at the same time. And it's packed with a lot of information in there. It's
that's
really,
fantastic. Now,
really,
looking forward to that as well.
yeah.
Yeah. So, Ken, I'd like to ask you to talk to us a little bit about your radio background and how you got into radio.
Radio's always been a part of my life since I can remember. I mean, I've been listening to the radio since the early 60s. And even before the Beatles, I can remember hearing music like the Four Seasons and the Beach Boys and Rick Nelson and Bobby Darin and, a lot of stuff later on, Roy Orbison, that maybe I didn't know who the artist was, but I remembered the songs.
Right.
But I always remember listening to Top 40 radio since I was a kid. And certainly 1964, the year that I discovered the Beatles through I Want to Hold Your Hand. That was such a tremendous year overall because not only was I absorbed in the Beatles and all their releases, their American releases, the singles and the albums, but I was listening to all the hits at the time and I devoured it. I loved all that stuff in the 60s and especially the 70s. The 70s is really my favorite decade of them all. And I love the 80s music too. But I
Yeah.
always followed hit music radio. And WABC was it for me in the 60s.
Man. Oh yeah. I mean, I love WABC.
Yeah.
Okay. You think about it those days and you know, I loved WABC and I love the energy from it. I love the humor that you felt I felt in listening to it. It was just a good feeling that came from listening to that station. And I have great memories of going to the beach, particularly down the Jersey Shore.
Uh-huh.
And you would walk in and you'd see these girls that would be checking to see that you had your credentials to be on the beach and things like that. And you go on to the beach and she'd be having a transistor radio or she'd have a small radio. She'd be playing WABC.
Right.
And then you'd be walking along the beach and you'd hear all kinds of music all over the place. Maybe there was a tape player, but you heard WABC on this blanket, on this one over there, this umbrella over there. They had WABC, and it was just such a cool idea. And WABC had all kinds of promos. I don't know
Yep.
if you remember, they used to have some kind of a deal. If you had a button or if you had a bumper sticker, or whatever, you could win $25,000 or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Did you have
Well,
a favorite DJ from WABC?
I miss those crazy days. And part of listening to the radio was the experience of listening to the DJs.
Yeah.
They always made you feel good. They each had their own personalities, although they were all usually very upbeat. Um, you know, I- they're all different in their own way. There's no one that could ever compare to a Dan Ingram in my
Oh,
eyes. Dan Ingram was the funniest DJ ever, very quick-witted, so much of what he said was over my head for a little kid. Later on, you listen back to old air checks, and it's like, oh, I'm getting what he's saying there, and he got away with a lot of stuff too.
Oh man, sure.
But
I mean,
you know, it's a lost art having a DJ that was part of the full experience of listening to the music too. I mean, the music was always first for me. The main reason I listened to Top 40 was for the music, but the DJs always made you feel good. And
right.
you know, I always remember, in particular, probably more late 60s and early 70s, Harry Harrison, Ron Lundy, Dan Ingram, Chuck Leonard, who I loved a lot,
Yeah,
Cousin
yeah.
Brucey, George Michael, all those people, they all had fantastic voices and great personalities. And the whole art of talking up a record, talking up the introduction till you hit the post, that is a lost art these days. And it's something that young people, unless you're brought up in that kind of an experience, you and studying radio, how much talent it takes to do that. You know, I have two stepsons who are now in their 40s. And every now and then, because I have a friend of mine, the same friend who actually suggested to me to do a Beatles show, which probably never would have happened if it wasn't for him. But he does like a top 40 format still on the radio. He talks up all the songs, he hits the posts and everything. And when my sons are listening to it, they're saying, why is he doing that? He's ruining the record. Let's hear the music. They
Yeah,
don't
yeah, yeah.
understand what it was like to grow up in that kind of an environment. You know, everybody was used to it. That's what DJs did.
Right. And I remember the controversies of, well, in particular when FM became more of a mainstay.
Yeah,
And people would say, well, no, I don't listen to WABC anymore all the time anymore because they always just talk up the record. And
right,
they're talking while the music is on, blah, 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 blah. You go to FM, they have a different way of handling it,
right.
FM is really more down and cool and easy. And this is the latest hit from Pink Floyd and da 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 da, whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
And you go to WABC and it's talking about pimple cream for 3 minutes until the song finally gets to the first line of the song. But I enjoyed it too, I love all those DJs. And, Cousin Brucey was a lot of fun. And, but I did love Dan Ingram. And I'd look forward to his honor group of the day thing and his word of the day and all these kind of
Right.
things that he would do. And he, like you said, he had great wit, and he was something to look forward to when he came home from school. What is
Exactly.
what was he going to say today?
I always remember hearing him talking up the way we were with Uncle
Okay.
Chris, and he was crawling inside Barbara's nose as he's talking. He would say things that, you know, it's to me, it's kind of how'd you get away with it? But you know, he would talk up a Stevie Wonder song and say, "Over here, Stevie, you sing it into a telephone pole." You know,
There's funny things about that as well. When he talked up a song by the Manhattans,
right?
and the song by the Manhattans was
Kiss and say goodbye.
which one?
Kiss and say goodbye.
Kiss and Say Goodbye
Yeah.
is the greatest talk up ever. He has this whole routine that would be so would never play today.
Right.
But it's something about a principal seeing his favorite student, wink, wink, and saying, "Well, this is our last day together." You go through this whole routine, and it was so, it's so blue in a way, for that kind of period anyway. And it's just so hysterical. I mean, I loved it, and that's my favorite talk up that he ever did was Kiss and Say Goodbye. It was
Oh,
fantastic.
there's plenty of them, and like you mentioned, the word of the day, all that stuff that he came up with. He certainly had a mind of his own.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you could say every DJ on that station was special. I love listening to Harry Harrison. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a great feeling to wake up in the morning and here's that voice as you're having your breakfast or having a cup of coffee, you know,
Yeah.
making you feel good on the way to work or on the way to school. And Ron Lundy was a gas. That was a guy that he was happy about everything, you know,
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
was cheerful with him. He would talk, you know, I used to joke about him and say that if there was a nuclear war, he'd be talking about it like he was. It's pretty amazing. All these bombs bursted in the air. You know, that's how he would be.
Yeah, very positive.
The greatest city in the world, New York City.
And it was great when those guys came over to CBS FM.
Yeah.
Because you could hear them all day long. By then I was working and I was able to put the radio on and I could listen to Ron and Harry in the morning and I'm not sure who was on in the afternoon. I think Don Dan Newcomb eventually came in for a while.
Yes.
I don't know if I think he popped into CBS FM, but kind of directly kicking and screaming.
And God bless him, Cousin Brucey's still at it. He's on WABC.
It's
He's
amazing.
on Saturday nights.
Yeah. Yeah, he and Tony Orlando have a show on Saturday nights on WABC.
Yep.
It's very strange, considering that WABC is all news, and that they are paying attention to their history and doing these Saturday night shows, and so, but radio in general, having these DJs, very important. Is very important, I think, for the community, building of a community, and having that connection.
And part of the reason why people went to certain events and certain concerts is if they heard that Cousin Brucey was going to be there or whatever.
Right.
And later on, I got into WPLJ in New York. And that was really interesting because when you look at the history of how radio's evolved, WPLJ was considered a rock station at the time. And if you did listen to them, they were playing Barry Manilow. They were playing, seriously. I mean, whatever sold in New York City, it didn't seem to matter. They played a lot of R&B. They played Stevie Wonder. They played Marvin Gaye. They played the Commodores. They played the Ozzy Brothers, on a rock station. Yeah. And it was cool. That was considered okay then, before everything got more and more defined with each format.
Which I think is the shame of it. If you listen to a lot of these, like I was just looking at the other day, I was looking at the top 100 lists that ABC would have, and just looking at all the different types of music that you would listen to. And then again, like you said, with the PLJ and some of these other stations where they would be playing in different types of music. So that everybody got a chance to see what was happening, or even oldies, could sprinkle a few oldies in during the course of the day, just so that, you kept it alive and you kept it going. And then nowadays everything is, well, you have your jazz station, you have your heavy metal station, you have whatever, you have R&B stations, this and that. So people are only interested in one particular thing. That's what they like. They don't get the broad view of music,
That's exactly what I complain about that all the time. And I feel very blessed and very fortunate that I grew up in the era that I did.
Yeah.
And I always say that apart from the Beatles, the biggest influence in my life has been Top 40 radio.
Right.
Because of what you just said. I always like to give the example. If you listen to Top 40 in the early 70s, you would have heard One Bad Apple by the Osmond Brothers and Superfly by Curtis Mayfield. And you would have heard, what would be country? Rose
Garden.
From
right. Lynn Anderson.
And you would have heard a whole lot of love from Led Zeppelin.
Right.
It was all on the same radio station. And I wasn't someone who said, I only like the rock. I absorbed all this stuff.
Yeah.
I love pop music. I love all kinds of music, novelty records, Ray Stevens, Jim Stafford, that kind of stuff.
Jim Stafford.
I was brought up on all that. So
right.
I have a deep appreciation for all those different genres of music. And a lot of that is because of the way Top 40 radio used to be. I don't know if you ever heard some of the conversations I've had with Al Sussman on my YouTube channel, but you go back to 1964 and right in the heart of Beatlemania, when they're exploding, Hello Dolly from Louis Armstrong is a number one record.
That's right.
In the 60s, you had people like Frank Sinatra still having hits.
Right.
Later on, Dean Martin.
Well, Dean Martin, Tom Jones,
Yeah. Tom Jones was still young back then. But, Perry Como had It's Impossible in
1967.
No, that was 71,
Oh, okay.
72 for Perry Como. That would
Okay.
never happen today with
No, no.
artists, unless it's someone who's teaming up with a new artist or a younger artist like Elton John does.
Right. So
So
that kind of molds into my one of my other questions.
yeah,
If you're looking at, taking an older artist and you're putting him with a new hit record, with a new album, okay, maybe aside from maybe like 1 week when it first comes out, isn't it a shame that a lot of these artists aren't getting playing time, even though they are still giving putting out quality music, but they're not
exactly.
getting it on top 40 radio?
Yeah, I complain about that all the time in my podcast shows because it doesn't just apply to the solo Beatles. It applies to every veteran artist that's out there
Hmm.
because of the fact that most of the buying public is made up of young people, a younger demographic. If a veteran artist has a new album out and it's not being programmed to those people, then the only people that are going to go out and buy it are the loyal fans that that artist has had all these years, and that's a very limited number of people. And what you found, and certainly in recent years, is you take a Paul McCartney, he has a new album out, it debuts very high. McCartney 3 debuted at number 2.
Yeah,
Um, Egypt Station went to number 1, but 1 month later, it's not even in the top 200
it's
because all
crazy.
the fans go out there and buy it all at once, and a younger audience is not exposed to it. So I say this about every single veteran artist that's out there. Bob Dylan went through the same thing with his last album, which was really praised, and it went to number 2. And a month later, it wasn't even on the charts. The Who put out a new album a few years ago,
Right.
which was praised as well. It did very well. It made the top 10. And then a month later, it's like everything is predetermined.
Let me ask you a question,
Success of
Ken.
of these records.
Let me ask you a question. Now, do you feel that the people that are programming these shows, whether it's the disc jockey or if it's somebody within the organization, are they saying that you have a restriction where you only can play what is on the charts or what we feel is the appropriate record for that demographic? Or does the DJ today still have the freedom to be able to say, okay, I want to push that new McCartney single. I want to push that new song by Bob Dylan and kind of get that in the rotation a couple of times a day. So this way, it does get in the people's ears, and then maybe they start requesting it.
Well, the DJs have very little control at all to what gets played. Most of that is determined by the program director, and the
Okay.
program director has to decide who is their audience and whether or not a new album from that artist is something that the audience is going to care about. And so what tends to happen is if Paul has a new album out, it'll get airplay for a week or two, just out of respect,
Yeah.
and then they just let the album die. They're actually they're operating in a way where they think this is what their audience wants. But by not playing the music, you're creating that scenario that the record's not going to do that well, and therefore people think that there isn't a demand for it.
That's the shame of it. Because if they did, um, I forget the title of the individual you mentioned, but the manager should
Program.
make a decision that they can't play this particular artist. They're not exposing the music to that audience and not
Right.
giving them the opportunity. And so, it would be great if, there was more flexibility involved, and that more that veteran artists in particular could get heard better. You know.
There is a format out there called AAA, which is the radio station that Darren DeVivo from Things We Said Today. He works at that station. There's a station on Long Island that I listen to every single day, WEHM. They're a AAA station, and they play new rock. It's not necessarily hard rock. It's more rock that has some of the qualities of 60s and 70s music,
Hmm.
very melodic. A lot of it's very acoustic, And those are the formats where a veteran artist like a McCartney um, can get some airplay, but usually it doesn't last very long.
Mm.
Robert Plant has gotten some airplay with his albums with Alison Krauss on that kind of a format of radio. But otherwise, it's just the hardcore fans going out buying it, and then the album dies a quick death.
Yeah, yeah.
And the only chance that any veteran artist has to really get massive airplay would be if they team up with somebody young.
Yeah, I mean, look, Elton John has had quite a lot of success in
Right.
doing some of these remix singles he does. Tiny Dancer, I think, is the more recent one. He did
Yeah.
something with his
He did.
track "The Kiss the Bride" a couple of years ago.
Well, that's the Dua Lipa, the collaboration there with Dua Lipa,
Hmm.
and had Rocket Man in there and
Right,
the
right.
Bride. The new one with Tiny Dancer is with Britney Spears.
Okay.
So, and they went top 10 in the
Yeah,
US. And Elton also teamed up with Ed Sheeran and did a Christmas single that did fairly well. I know it went to number one in the UK.
right.
So, it's all in the way that you look at it. There are people that see that kind of thing working with a young artist to get a hit as selling out.
Yeah,
There are still people that feel that, Paul shouldn't have worked with Michael Jackson, or Stevie Wonder. And that's 40 years ago now.
right.
But, Stevie Wonder was a contemporary of Paul's anyway.
Absolutely.
So I mean, there are people who frown on that kind of thing.
Right, right,
You
right.
know, it's a way of getting a younger audience to hear your music. Neil Young, when he worked with Pearl Jam,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So, a lot of the older fans may not like when they team up with somebody younger like that. Who are these people who probably aren't worthy enough to be sharing a record with a McCartney or somebody like that?
Yeah.
Um,
I
I'm
still find it
glad that
surprising though, Elton John in his career, even, having solo singles on his own well into the 90s, well into 2000s. Maybe not number one, or maybe not even top five, but or maybe it was adult contemporary, whatever. But it
yeah,
was still getting considerable amount of either critical response or being played on adult radio, adult contemporary radio, and so forth. And so it does kind of surprise me. It frustrates me when I see an artist that I love, like a Paul McCartney or like a David Cassidy.
mm,
David Cassidy is somebody whose music who I feel has never really been truly appreciated. Um, uh, I know that you were a big Partridge Family fan. Am I correct on that?
well, I think certainly no. I'm very proud of the fact that I love the Partridge Family. I bring up the Partridge Family every now and then, when I have conversations with people in my love of music, because I'm not the least bit ashamed, of my appreciation for their music. But before I talk about the Partridge Family,
Okay,
you were mentioning adult contemporary.
right.
And what a lot of artists have done, Elton John is the best at it, was to find another format of radio that would receive his music better. And since Elton is such a master at putting out a lot of, and I know he's done rock too, a lot of ballady stuff, a lot of soft stuff. So many of his singles fit that adult contemporary format. And so single after single that he put out from the 80s on up, and a lot of that I love a lot too, fit that format.
Sure.
Rod Stewart is another one that had
Yes.
enormous success with adult contemporary, and to a lesser degree, but a significant degree, Eric Clapton when he was doing Unplugged, and
Oh
he,
my God, it was that was tremendous when those records came out, or those shows came out.
yeah,
Totally brought him right back to being right in the whatever you want to consider top 40 to be.
right.
But right there, he was right back in there again.
But you had all these different charts, and the adult contemporary chart is not the same thing as the Hot 100. It's a completely different chart. It's still impressive if you can do well on any chart. But those other artists did very well. In fact, Paul had decent success on the adult contemporary charts too.
Right.
Not as much as Elton by far and away, or even
Yeah.
Rod Stewart, but he still had significant success on the adult contemporary charts. You got to find some kind of format that's more willing to play your music. And even now, those same people, Paul, Elton, Rod, they would have difficulty being played on adult contemporary.
Oh yeah, because now Britney Spears is the adult contemporary artist.
Well, those the ones I mentioned are now even too old for that format.
Yeah.
And it's ridiculous. You know, to me, music should be played on what's good. You know, there's too much, radio is too much about marketing, more so than music. And that's the problem that I've had with it through the years. But I have to work with it because that's been my career.
Yeah, man.
But
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's great that you have this career and it's something that you love and you're so passionate about the music and about the radio and so forth that you get a chance to do that. You know, my father and I would talk about, what kind of a career do you want, Ed? And he'd always say to me, do something that you love. Now I
mhm.
got into insurance and which I like. I like working with people. It's not something I'm passionate about, but it is something I like doing. So I'm glad for you that you're doing something that you have real passion for.
Yeah. Well, I knew early on that I wanted to have a career on the air in radio. And I never even thought about doing a Beatles show at all. It was never my idea to do it.
Yeah.
I envisioned myself being a top 40 DJ, but I knew I could never be what Dan Ingram was. I could only be who I was. And or maybe being an adult contemporary DJ or an album rock DJ. But once I started doing the Beatles show, then that kind of took over because it was an all-consuming thing for me. And I tried to get my show on a radio station as a live broadcast. I was able to do that from college radio, where it started, to a rock
Mm,
station in New Jersey, WDHA,
yeah.
where it ran for 10 years. And then after that, it was heard on XM radio for 6 years. And then after that, there's a college radio station that ran it for, I don't know, 7, 8 years. But I also developed the show so that it would be a syndicated radio show, and it's heard on about 50 radio stations. A
That's
lot of them
amazing.
that's 50, most of them are internet only stations, but I do have some terrestrial radio stations, FM and AM.
That's
But
fantastic.
the Partridge Family, though, I will tell you something. I've discovered about myself that um, I really am all about the song when it comes to music. The song is the most important part of any recording. The reason why the Beatles catalog has endured is because it's great songs first. What the Beatles brought to them made a difference, obviously. But if they weren't great songs to begin with, we wouldn't be talking about them. And so I've developed nothing but the greatest appreciation for great songwriters.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the Partridge Family, I equate them very much with the Monkees
Right.
because they both had TV shows. They were perfect vehicles for their music. And the Monkees had the cream of the crop songwriters of Brill Building songwriters.
Mm,
And of course, it took Mickey Dolenz' great vocals and Davy Jones, who was a great singer who had theatrical background, and no denying how brilliant Mike Nesmith was. And I love Peter too, and the songs that he brought to them.
right.
But if you didn't have Carole King and Jerry Goffin, and you didn't have Neil Diamond, and you didn't have Boyce and Hart,
And Sears and Roebuck.
Sedaka, what's that?
And Sears and Roebuck, as Davy Jones likes to say.
Yeah. Hey, they even had David Gates, for one of
Yeah.
and it's the same thing with the Partridge Family. They had Wes Farrell, who was an incredible songwriter. If Yes, I love David Cassidy's voice, and I think he had a tremendous voice.
Mm,
But the songs that Wes Farrell wrote were fantastic. They had another guy, Tony Romeo,
yeah.
who wrote I Think I Love You.
It's one of those nights. It's one of those nights. Yes, love. Point me in the direction of Albuquerque.
Yeah,
And some of the very best stuff that they recorded came out of Tony Romeo.
yeah. And I just
Yeah.
love them as songs, and they were recorded very well. Of
Yeah.
course, they had studio musicians.
Right.
like the Monkees did. Uh,
Right.
and so what about the fact that, the Partridge Family were not a real band? David Cassidy had a great voice. Shirley
Right.
Jones had all that history of
Yeah.
doing musicals, and she was a great singer, very good for harmony vocals there. I mean, but the songs that the Partridge Family put out were really very strong. And
Right.
apart from loving the singles, and it's one of those nights is probably my favorite song of theirs. I just think it's a masterpiece. My favorite songs of theirs are the songs that weren't the singles. you
Yeah.
know, so it tells you how strong their catalog was. Um, Paul Anka even wrote one of their songs,
Yeah.
One Night
Yeah.
Stand. He was a co-writer, I think.
Right. Right. Right.
So they had really good songwriters, and that's what it's all about for me. I wish a few years ago I interviewed Jimmy Webb, who was one of the greatest songwriters, in the rock era. So many great songs he's written, from MacArthur Park to Up and Away, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of great songs. I wish I could do a podcast show just on songwriters.
Yeah. That'd be great.
Songwriters that may not be known for being the performers. And unfortunately, Wes Farrell and Tony Romeo died
Yeah.
quite a while ago, and the same
Right.
year too.
Yeah. It's like the late 90s, I think it was.
Man, I wish I could have met those two.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think you listen to a lot of the stuff, especially the first four albums. I think of Sound Magazine
Yes.
and Shopping Bag. Shopping Bag could be my favorite of all their albums.
I think the production wise, Shopping Bag is their best production. The just the bringing in the orchestrations and so forth, and the harmonies are so fantastic. They're just so written so well and
Hmm,
performed so well, you know. And you
right.
think about that Wrecking Crew band and Jackie Ward and the Bayers brothers and Ron Hicklin. They did a
Yeah,
fantastic job in helping Wes and David to make those records, you know.
right. Those
Um,
are just very well constructed songs,
yeah,
and very well produced.
yeah.
Uh, and that's why I cherish them. And I have this sympathy for a lot of these artists who get labeled teen idols.
Oh yeah,
They all have a lifespan or a chart span of like 2, 3 years,
right.
and it doesn't seem to matter how good their music is in what followed. And it's really sad. I grew up, since I'm talking about the early 70s, with the Jackson Five and the Osmond Brothers at the same time coming out. And I thought they were both extremely talented,
Right.
you know? So, but most of the time, well, Michael Jackson turned out to be one of the most successful artists ever.
Amazing artists, you know, and then you'd see, well, why isn't the Donny Osmond isn't able to duplicate the success, you know, or meet it somewhere in the middle, you
Yeah.
know? But then again, you can talk about success like that and wonder, okay, well, he didn't have this or that, but he did have other success. Take a look at what they did with their variety show.
Hmm.
So it may not have been chart success as far as a singer-songwriter or as a singer, but he had great success with a variety show that went on for quite a number of years and a very good life after that. It just necessarily wasn't in the pop music area, you know.
Mhm.
David Cassidy seemed to be ignored after, the Partridge Family years ended, and that was my issue.
Right.
I get very emotional about the music. The music to me is oxygen, and so a lot of these artists that I've listened to since I was 7 or 8 years old, whatever, 9 years old, it stays with you because I care about, where are they now? What happened after this? Why didn't why didn't this song become a hit record? And things like that. So I get riled up about that kind of stuff.
I
And
hear you. But
David Cassidy recorded I Write the Songs. He recorded it with Carl Wilson, I believe, was the producer. And of
okay,
course, it was written by fellow Beach Boy
Bruce Johnston.
Bruce Johnston, right? And so I kind of figured, and I don't have the dates as to when it was recorded, but that should have been the original. And then somehow or other, Clive Davis got his hands on the song, gave it to Barry Manilow.
Mhm.
And of course, that becomes a huge record. And of course, Manilow made a great record out of it. And I love Manilow. Don't get
Right.
me wrong. Manilow is right up there for me in my favorite artists. But in my view of how much I love David Cassidy, that should have been his record. That should have been
Mhm.
his number one record.
Right. Well,
I get frustrated with stuff like that.
but David at least had success with the theater with
Oh, he
Joseph.
did.
And looking back, I wish that I had seen him then and
Yeah.
also in Blood Brothers.
Yeah. Blood Brothers was wonderful. I saw him in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was wonderful. But it's wonderful that we have these artists and we have something like radio where we're able to all get this all, everybody gets a chance to hear this and be able to have that kind of communication with someone, to have that relationship with a DJ that maybe hit home. They said something, a particular thing to make you feel good. Harry Harrison, for instance, was always so genuine, I believe, in the way he spoke. It's like kind of like Ringo in a way. Everything he said was genuine. Everything was heartfelt,
Right.
and you really felt something coming out of that voice.
Hmm.
And that's something that I really took out of WABC and listening to radio in general, is to seeing what the message was coming from the disc jockey or from the radio station back to me, the listener. And I'm certainly glad that you were in a position to be able to do that for your audience.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty lucky in the fact that for me, one of the reasons why I'm the big Beatle fan that I am is because I grew to really love them as solo artists and to see how well they did on the charts, especially in the 70s, to a lesser degree the 80s. But I marvel at people that can have success twice.
Mm,
I used to this may seem like I'm going off on a tangent, but my favorite TV show of all time is the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
yeah,
I was in love with Mary. And of course, she was in the Dick Van Dyke Show before that. And so to be in two very successful sitcoms like that, that are especially now iconic, is extraordinary. And the number of people that have success once, it's always like, one in a million to have that. And then to have it twice. Um, but in the case of the Beatles, you had all four of them on their own do very well. And I think that's something that everybody overlooks,
yeah,
especially a young fan now that's just getting into the Beatles. And I'm very grateful that they're discovering the group. But
fantastic.
there's this other life out there that happened after 1970.
Right.
All you got to do is look at the charts and see how well they did. And when that music was programmed to the buying public, a younger audience, this is how well it did.
Yeah,
There isn't anybody on this planet that wouldn't kill to have had the career that Paul McCartney's had as a solo artist,
right.
or any of them for that matter. And so, growing up in the 70s, especially following the charts, knowing week to week how each of the solo Beatles were doing and my other favorite songs of the time, it was really exciting for me. I
Yeah,
just absolutely love that whole musical period, the
right.
60s, the 70s, and to some degree the 80s. And I'm not dismissing the music that followed, because there's always going to be new music that I will enjoy from each decade.
Right.
Uh, there wasn't a complete drop off for me after the 80s. And I've grown to love the 50s too. I like to try to appreciate music from all eras and all genres.
Right.
But yeah, radio has been at the center of all of it. And I think as much as I love spending time on YouTube, and especially if I can find time to listen to other Beatle podcasts, so many of the people who are doing them are young that didn't grow up when radio was as important as I was, and they don't understand that whole. We wouldn't be here talking about the Beatles if it wasn't for radio.
Yeah.
Radio gave them the exposure that they needed, first on the BBC and later in the rest of the world. What would have happened if it didn't happen that way?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and everything the Beatles did in the 60s became an event. Every new single, every new album.
And the funny thing is that that was also sort of a an odd thing for WABC to do. If you're talking about when they came in in February of '64 and they arrived in the USA, and somehow or other the program manager or whoever it was decided, you know what? Let's have WABC meet them at at the airport, and let's do a whole big to do. I mean, it could have been something like, we don't really, we'll play their records, but we're not necessarily going to make a big to do about it. But
Right.
it's a huge part of our history of the Beatles is the reception that they received. And of course, they brought in so many people to come to JFK, or I guess it was Idlewild at the time,
Right.
to go to the airport, making it an event,
Right.
and it's just it's amazing. I mean, how much of a power that WABC and other radio stations had to be able to do that with their audience. You've got to come out to JFK to see the Beatles.
I can't even imagine. Well, I was there at the time, but I was 4 years old when all that was going on. So just the avalanche of all that Beatles music that had built up from 1962, from Lovely,
Right,
that came out in that first half of 1964, and you had so many singles all on the charts at the same time, and the
right.
top five occupying the top five at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. How extraordinary that was.
Sure.
And, among my many favorite memories of growing up in the 60s was I used to have what you have behind you. Those 45s. And I had a little, 45 carrying case, and you had to write down the song titles and the artists. And I used to love knowing the labels, and I love the Capital Swirl label. And you knew that if you had the Parrot label, that you either had a Tom Jones record or an Engelbert Humperdinck record, or if you had an Epic single, that you had a Dave Clark 5 single or a Donovan single. You know, I love that. I have great memories of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and buying 45s too. I
Yeah.
didn't have the money to buy albums. The only albums I really bought were Beatles and maybe some soundtracks here and there, like The Sound of Music, you know. Uh, and that was it for me in the 60s. But what an incredible time to grow up and to be exposed to so much great music all at once.
Yeah.
And music that still sounds great all these years later.
Absolutely.
um, you know, it's like I've said so many times, it's part of our DNA. And you don't realize it when it first comes out, how important this music is going to be to you. Because it's always the music that you grew up listening to when you were, an adolescent and a teenager, and to some degree the 20s. That's going to be the biggest music of your life, no matter
Right
what.
on. Right on. And the funny thing is also when you're in that time period is that you're looking at this is the music that I care about. And this is the best. This is the best music there is. So I don't want to hear about Frank Sinatra from 30, 40 years ago. I don't want to hear about this or that one. And then all of a sudden you get a little older, and all of a sudden, hey, I'm listening to this now. I like this. No, I like
Mhm.
that. Now I can appreciate it. But especially when you're an adolescent and when you're in your 20s, whatever, it's like a narrow thing. Well, maybe it's not a narrow thing. It really depends upon what you were exposed to. But you do find it becomes very personal to you.
Yeah.
Anyway, um, first of all, I just want to say thank you for being on our show today.
Oh,
It's really great. Ken Michaels, as you guys all should know by now, is a veteran DJ, and he's been on various radio shows. Every Little Thing, you can catch that on what station? Where can you hear the Every Little Thing now?
well, it's on over 50 stations, but I will tell you that on my website, which is kenmichaelsradio.com, there is a page for every little thing, and it lists all the radio stations and the broadcast times for each with links to all the stations' websites so you can stream them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an easier way to listen, and there's only one way that you can get the show on demand. And WFDU, which is the college station at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey, they run my show normally Sunday mornings at 6 a.m. Eastern. After the show airs, they place it on their website for 2 weeks. So you can hear that show for the next 2 weeks, and they have two of my shows up there on their website. So you don't have to listen at a specific time. You got a whole 2 weeks to listen to it. But
Hmm.
every little thing, are you familiar with what I do with every
I've
little?
I've heard I've heard some of the some of the episodes. I
Yes.
believe that there was a Canadian station that was playing it
Oh,
recently,
yeah.
right? That
FM
like a
108.
marathon.
On John Lennon's birthday. They
Yeah,
ran 24 hours straight of every little thing. And I was
yeah,
so flattered that they did that. But I mean, every little thing is the show that I've been doing since March of 1982. It didn't have that title then. When my show was picked up on XM radio, and this was XM radio before they merged with Sirius, I came up with the title of Every Little Thing. The show is really anything possible you can imagine in a Beatles show. It's group music, it's solo music, it's hits, it's deep cuts, it's B-sides, it's songs that were released as import CD singles, it's cover versions of Beatles songs, it's side projects that the Beatles
yeah.
were involved with. Side projects is something I really love talking about. And there's a guy that I've interviewed, Chris Engelhart, who just put out a book. I might even have it here somewhere. Fully undercovered. He's really well known for. He's put out a series of books that deal with songs the Beatles either wrote or produced or play on for other artists. So you go all the way back to Billy J. Kramer and Peter and Gordon and those songs,
Right.
way up to Come and Get It with Badfinger and Mine for Me, which Paul wrote for Rod Stewart,
Hmm.
to On the Wings of a Nightingale that Paul wrote for the Everlys, a
It's a
song that
beautiful song.
there's a song that George played slide guitar on for Belinda Carlisle. All this stuff he puts in his book, and I feature that kind of thing in
Cool.
my show. Apple recording artists, members of Beatles families, tribute songs to the Beatles, tribute songs to John or to George, novelty records on the Beatles. There's no telling in the 1 hour show, that's the syndicated show, what you're going to hear. But I do believe you can't just fill it with all obscure stuff. You got to play some hits. You got to
Yeah,
play songs that people know. To me, anything the Beatles did as a group, even if it wasn't a hit, is like the alphabet to me. How can you not know and miss any of those songs? But
yeah, yeah.
there are people who think, I was just at a George Harrison festival in Massachusetts, and I sat with a couple where there was a band playing Helter Skelter, and they were saying, "We're hardcore fans. We're into this song. Helter Skelter, please." um, some people think that that's really going deep, but I play. I mean, anything from the solo careers of the Beatles, which is why it's called Every Little Thing. I even
Mhm.
have played Paul's classical music in the show. So it's the sky's the limit in that program.
It allows you to be very creative,
It is very
So I'm
creative.
glad you still enjoying doing that and putting that radio show out for all of us to hear.
Yeah,
And then there's the other podcasts. You're all over the place with the podcasts, and so we have things we said today,
right.
which I messed up on earlier, but it's one of my favorite Paul McCartney, Lennon and McCartney songs, but Paul song. And
Uh-huh.
so you have that as a podcast, and I don't hear that one too much. But what are you doing with that one?
Well, that's a show that I do with Darren DeVivo, who works at WFUV, and Alan Kozin, who spent many years as a writer in the classical department for the New York Times, but he's also known for being a contributing writer for Beatle Fan magazine. And he's written a series of books on the Beatles, one called From the Cavern to the Rooftop, and another one called Got That Something, How I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything. And he's also, as I said earlier, one of two authors, along with Adrian Sinclair, for the McCartney Legacy, which is coming out in December 13th to be exact. And we cover anything about the Beatles, group, solo years. Every one of my podcast shows has news in it at the top of the show. Very often between things we said today and the other one, Talk More Talk, you're going to get some of the same news, but if you listen to both shows that are even close in time, there's always going to be some difference of some items that'll be in one show and not in the other.
Right,
We really talk about anything. We just obviously did a couple of shows on the Revolver box set.
right.
Um, we did a landmark interview with the guy that gave us Get Back,
Oh, that's right. That was fantastic.
and
Fantastic. Peter
yeah,
Jackson.
Peter Jackson, and that was almost 4 hours long.
Wow.
And that was the week of Get Back premiering on Disney Plus. He gave
Right.
us an interview, and he actually approached us. I
That's
mean,
amazing.
you know,
That's
how
amazing.
that he has listened to our show, and evidently he's a fan of things we said today. But he explained a lot of what was in Get Back, and he also talked about the whole technology that's now so advanced, which even played a part in the Revolver box set, where you can isolate everything in a recording studio. And it was demonstrated actually in our show when the Beatles were rehearsing, and a lot of the surface noise and them talking to each other over while they're playing,
Right.
you can actually separate the talk and the
Yeah.
chat, you know. It's just like everything now can be separated.
Yeah.
A lot of the problems. Giles Martin talked about the problem with Revolver, that you would have a song like Taxman and you would have the bass and the drums on the same track. Well, now with today's technology, what his people developed, and there's other people that have developed something similar, but his is supposed to be like the most advanced for now. You can separate everything, and it makes it a lot easier to do remixes.
I
If
guess so. Yeah.
so, we've covered so many different topics. It's incredible. Just go to our YouTube channel and you'll see all of our shows there.
Right on. And then you have and then so the other podcast is Talk More Talk, which you do with Kid O'Toole and Tom Magnotti and Joe Mayo.
Right.
Everybody check that out. That's where I was introduced to you through that. And so and it's just an enjoyable podcast about the solo Beatles. It's a video cast as well for all my people out there. So you can see you guys enjoying chatting with each other, and as Ken just described, you get a bit of news, a lot of news on the Beatles stuff and solo Beatles stuff, what's happening, and then it usually a panel discussion
Mhm.
on a particular album or a particular artist within the Beatles. So
Yeah.
anyway, it was really great and it's good stuff.
Yeah. Most of the time it's a solo Beatle topic. Once in a rare moment, we do go back to the group, like when Revolver came out, we had to say something about it.
Right,
So yeah, anytime there's these archival box sets on the group, we have to talk about that. And it's a lot of analysis talking about solo Beatle albums, certain periods. We've done tribute shows to George and to John, all kinds of things. We're going to do a show on Ringo's Old Wave album, and that's the next show that we're doing. And by the way, the YouTube broadcast is a live broadcast, which
right,
happens every other Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. And so the next show that we're doing, which is November the 28th, will be the show on Ringo's Old Wave album. I mean, where else are you going to find people talking about Old Wave?
right, right.
And,
Exactly. It's
we,
cool.
we're very honest and candid in our opinions about the solo music. I tend to be extremely supportive of most of what they've done in their solo careers. And then there are some of the other co-hosts who are a bit more critical.
Right.
And that's fine as long as you know the music and you can talk about it. That's all that really matters. So it's an important thing to us that the solo music of the Beatles doesn't get forgotten. I just I would hate to think that there's only a few songs and albums from the solo careers that will ever matter. I hate to think it would all come down to Ben on the Run, Imagine, All Things Must Pass, and the
Yeah,
Ringo
yeah.
album.
Right,
It,
right,
there's
right,
so
right,
much
right,
more to their careers than that.
right.
And um, I always like to say in the case of Paul and Ringo, whereas there's no doubt that they both put out a lot of really good stuff in the 70s, and Paul certainly had a lot of commercial success in the 70s. I really think that he became even more creative from the 80s on up.
It's amazing, and I'd love to talk to you more about these kinds
Yeah.
of things as we go on, because yeah, particularly when it comes to McCartney, there's so much he's done, I think in the last 20 some odd years. That
Right.
he's become an even better writer and so forth. So
Hmm.
Ken, I want to say thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay.
And I'd like to and hopefully maybe another time we'll get on, we'll talk about all these kinds of things and maybe even the Mets. We'll talk about the Mets.
Okay. And you'll be on my channel.
I'd love it. I'd love it. Okay. So everybody, this is Ed's Pop-O-Matic podcast, where it's a retro podcast for everybody, everything retro beats the new if you keep it in your heart and if you remember the words, that helps too. And I thank you all for listening and have a great day. And I'm gonna